Hello and welcome back to the SportsPro podcast. Welcome back because we've been away for 3 weeks, in fact, on a 3-week hiatus. And if you've been wondering what we've been up to, we have been, well, at least our content and production teams have been delivering an event in New York City, our annual SportsPro New York conference. And indeed, it was 2 events this year, with the first edition of SportsPro AI USA taking place alongside the main event in Manhattan. We've also been busy for the last few weeks drawing up plans for a refreshed, reimagined SportsPro podcast, so stay tuned for more on that, as well as other projects and events happening later this year. So more to come on all of that in due course. But for this episode, we are going to be reflecting on another significant event that took place last week. And it was, of course, the IOC presidential election over in Greece. And with me to do that are my esteemed colleagues, Sam Carp and Ed Dixon, features and deputy editor, respectively. How are you, chaps?
Very well, thanks, Mike. How are you getting on?
Very well, very well. It's good to have you both dialing in for this. How are you, Ed?
Very well, thanks, mate. I like the heavy sigh when you said esteemed colleague, so yeah.
I didn't pick up on that.
Apologies. Well, my fellow SportsPro stalwarts, old-timers, whatever we're going to call you. Guys, in the spirit of past SportsPro episodes, where we've typically discussed or reveal whether we actually watched the event in question or not, did you follow along to the IOC presidential election last week?
I did. We had a live stream on the go.
Of course.
And actually, Mike, we were on a call and you cut it short early because you said the election result was about to happen. And maybe that was an excuse. You were just fed up of talking to me. But we thought this could take several rounds, but we had a decisive victor in the first round. It was all very, very quick and speedy.
We did indeed. Sam, did you tune in?
I did, yeah. Do you reckon there was white smoke coming out of the chimney of Costa Navarino, the luxury resort that the IOC election was taking place in? Or do you reckon it's a little bit? Do you reckon they have a different way of signalling the election of a new president?
Well, quite possibly. I mean, Ed, I know you've referred to the IOC as the kind of United Nations of sport due to the kind of levels of bureaucracy that seemingly swirl about the organisation. But it is a bit of a papal conclave, isn't it? With the how the votes go down, conducted in complete secrecy, and lobbying happens behind the scenes in the corridors of power of Lausanne and all that, and candidates restricted by what they can say to the media and about their rivals, etc. So it's always an interesting one when it is revealed and how it all goes down. But what were your immediate reflections on how it did go down? Your immediate reaction? Obviously a 7-candidate field with Kirsty Coventry from Zimbabwe winning out.
Surprised. I was kind of, just in terms of what Ed mentioned there, with only taking one round, I think there was 97 votes in total. The winner needed a majority. So basically the exact number of votes that Coventry got in that first round, which was 49, very convenient, followed by Samaranch with 28 and then Lord Sebco with 8. And I say surprised because obviously in the build up to all this, it was kind of billed as a 3-horse race. In the end, it was 2 at a stretch. I sort of just assumed that in those early rounds, you'd probably have a couple of candidates being eliminated, and then obviously some of those votes would go elsewhere, and then, you know, maybe we'd have an exciting final round where there were only 2 remaining. So it was kind of a bit of an anticlimax in that sense after all the build up to it, and then it was all over in basically a couple of minutes, I think. But yeah, I suppose one of the front runners has come through. It did kind of feel like Samaranch Jr. had started to become the sort of consensus candidate in the weeks leading up to it. So kind of surprising in that way as well. And perhaps also just made me realise how much we kind of, in the UK at least, so much of the coverage is around Coe, and maybe made a few people think that he perhaps had a better chance than he maybe did among the IOC membership, given, you know, the kind of reforms that he'd put forward as a candidate perhaps didn't quite chime with the IOC membership in the way that Coventry did as a kind of more continuity candidate.
I did a piece to mark 10 years of Thomas Bach's reign, and a lot of the people I spoke to said he will have a big say in his successor. And so if you put 2 and 2 together, it was generally assumed that Kirsty Coventry was his preferred candidate, and it was sort of emphatically apparent, sort of this benevolent overlord of the IOC, you know, sort of his influence. It sort of shows how entrenched Bach has made himself during his time at the IOC, and indeed his sort of perhaps lingering influence when he does formally step down. It's probably worth, I guess, touching on sort of how big a milestone moment this is for the IOC and indeed wider sport. You know, she's the youngest person ever to be IOC president, first woman, first from outside Europe or North America to lead the IOC in its 130-year history. You know, the figurative glass ceiling has been smashed. I guess the attention now is going to turn to, you know, what in tray is going to be, and you know there's quite a lot in there which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, absolutely. Keen to obviously not focus too much on what went down last week and look ahead to the future of the IOC and what Coventry has in store to deal with, and the wider Olympic movement that she will spearhead from June onwards after a period of shadowing Bach. Yeah, and as you say, it certainly is a milestone, I think, for the IOC and the Olympic movement. You know, yes, she's a continuity candidate, as you've said there, Sam, and as you referenced there, Ed, she's, you know, Bach's anointed one. You know, one of the earliest kind of reporting in the race was that she was Bach's pick and she was therefore a front runner or a favourite. There's many that are saying that she won't rock the boat or ruffle too many feathers. And why would she really? I mean, the Olympic movement's in pretty rude health and it has been, you know, on an upward trajectory in various senses under Bach. And I guess in many ways with Coventry at the helm, you know, she feels to me like the kind of ideal person to lead the IOC right now. As you say, the youngest ever president, she's female, 41, first African. The IOC membership, the 97 who voted, can say, we're going in a different direction now. You know, it's not the old kind of male, pale, stale kind of Olympic movement that it once was. But also at the same time, without having to worry about too much, if anything, actually changing. Because, you know, she is that continuity candidate. So, yeah, do you feel like Coventry is a bit of a symbol for that? Or, you know, do you feel like she's going to reform and modernise the movement as she said that she's going to do in her manifesto and in the interviews she's done?
She has to come down on one side of the fence for certain things. You know, I know that certain instances the IOC plays its apolitical card, if you like, but you know there are several things really that she needs to make a decision on. And I guess one of the concerns or criticisms maybe in the lead up to the election was her manifesto was quite sort of broad. It maybe lacked specifics in certain areas, but actually when she was questioned on certain things, she did have quite a clear stance on things. So one of those is protecting women's sports. You know, she's in favor of a blanket ban there. Obviously there's the return of Russia as well. You know, she's got to make a decision there. And then I guess beyond that, there's, well, things like who's going to host the 2036 games. There's the Winter Olympics model as well, because they're not exactly, you know, got potential hosts coming out of their ears, do they? There's climate change to address, and then sort of political things like dealing with Donald Trump for LA 2028. So there's only so much she can, I guess, kick the can down the road or sort of lean into the status quo, really. You know, she will need to come down on one side of the fence, as I said, but I imagine it'll be a similar-ish sort of stance that perhaps her predecessor will have taken.
I think in many ways, to go back to your original question, Mike, she said in her press conference after that she was quite keen for, you know, her gender and where she was from not to inform the voting too much, I think. And she was kind of quite thankful to the members that she felt like that wasn't the case. But I do think in many ways, and perhaps like part of the reason why she did, well, obviously he hasn't said this publicly, but part of the reason Bach was perhaps vouching for her was that she is kind of, going back to what you said, kind of it feels like she's sort of the embodiment of that Olympic agenda 2020 plus 5 that he mapped out, in the sense that like the IOC having a female leader, it's a kind of embodiment of its shift towards, you know, more gender equality, both at the Olympics but also within the organisation that runs it. The fact that she's from Africa sort of embodies the fact that they've been looking to take the games to new audiences as well, and kind of new regions. And also just, the fact that she's the youngest IOC president in history sort of embodies their mission to kind of take the games to younger audiences now as well. So I think they've kind of got the person there who speaks to a lot of those things. It's also interesting because if you look at who was voting last Thursday compared to perhaps who was voting when Bach became president, there's actually a lot more women in the IOC membership now. They've like taken real strides to change that. I think I counted 47 on the website today, which is, you know, only 2 less than the number of votes she did. Not as simplistic to just suggest that every woman in the IOC membership would have voted for her, but there definitely would have been some within that, I'm sure, who would have wanted to see a woman leading the organisation. So I think that's kind of definitely part of it as well. In terms of what Ed said there, I agree that her manifesto was pretty light on detail. It was very sort of surface level, calls for change in certain areas without necessarily going into too much. But I think in a way that might have worked in her favour. As we've kind of mentioned, the IOC doesn't necessarily like change too much. So when you have some of your rivals putting forward ideas for 24-hour Olympics, things like that, it's almost better for them to kind of scare off those members with some of their ideas. And then after you win the election, start to put forward some of yours, perhaps in more detail, or maybe even mop up some of their best ones and and kind of drive them forward in that way. So I think she kind of played it quite well in that sense. And that IOC membership is not one necessarily that wants too much drastic change. And there has been quite a lot under Bach. So I'm sure that kind of her continuing that vision was quite attractive to them.
Yeah, all the manifestos were quite vague, to be fair. Yeah, it was. It sort of felt more like vibes in the run-up.
Some of them did have specific things that they wanted to do. So
yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just sort of saying, like, just not wanting to single out Kirsty Coventry. A lot of them were quite vague on certain issues. Some were quite firm on certain things. But yeah, vibes did seem to be the order of the day.
I guess that's the game you play, right? You have your headline manifesto pledges, your catchy acronyms for things and things like that. A slickly produced document, but the detail you can kind of leave out and come to later. You don't want to be too committal one way or the other at the risk of ruffling too many feathers and, coming down too hard on one side or the other, or being too polarizing.
Otherwise, you end up with 8 votes like Seb Coe.
Indeed. Well, let's not talk about Coe, because obviously 8 votes out of 97 is pretty, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But let's talk about the state of the IOC and what Coventry is inheriting. You've kind of touched upon it there, guys, in what you were saying, but this is a role as a president, it's a broad remit, it's a broad agenda. You've got to balance the political with the commercial imperatives of the organization. But ultimately, and that's something that Bach did very, very well. He departs with the IOC in pretty rude health. I think total revenue was 7.6-ish billion for the last quadrennial up until last year. So that's 60% growth in commercial revenue within that under Bach, which is pretty phenomenal growth, let's say, over the last 12 years or so. Coming off the back of Paris as well, record attendances, incredible viewership, as there typically is for the Olympic Games, huge social engagement, etc. Feels like the Games rediscovered their kind of mojo there as well. A bit of a parting gift from Bach in terms of the last piece of business he did was a big $3 billion deal with Comcast/NBC in the US and the TV deal there. So yeah, well, what do you make of the kind of current state, the commercial health, let's say, if we're going to do a health check on the Olympic movement, on the IOC, and what Coventry is inheriting?
Yeah, as you say, it's in very strong position, as well as that kind of 7.6 billion that you just mentioned, Mike, from Paris. I think they even said it's gone up to 7.7 Bach announced out in Greece. So they found another 100 million from somewhere. But yeah, they've obviously got 7.3 billion secured for the next quadrennial as well, and 6.2 billion beyond that. Might even be more now that they've got this new top partnership with TCL as well. So on the surface, it's pretty good top line growth, but I guess there's still definitely questions. There's been lots of reasons given for why 4 partners departed the top program last year, obviously 3 of them being Japanese companies, so it kind of makes sense that they would be leaving basically after a sequence of games in Asia. Also ATOS, who kind of had problems of their own. But there's been one of the big sort of conversations around the election campaign was what value kind of partners are getting from being part of that top sponsorship program. There's always focus on the lack of exposure that they get within the field of play. No candidates kind of seem prepared to buckle on that, and I'm sure that Coventry won't either. But I guess just in terms of how those partnerships are maybe structured differently, what they can do to kind of, I suppose, give them more touch points throughout those 2-year gaps between games to keep them more involved, and whether it's kind of, do they restructure the top program in any way? Do they introduce different tiers to make it more affordable for certain companies and that aren't just kind of those very, very top level, interesting as well. So basically, how do you bring more revenue into that ecosystem? And then also on the media side, one of the things Coventry spoke about in a manifesto was, she obviously recognized the changing media landscape, how streaming is having more of an impact now. But I guess it's just that NBC deal that you just mentioned also. It was interesting to see the way that that was spoken about in the announcement. No, it wasn't just a traditional TV rights deal. There's lots of other things in there that NBC will be involved in terms of technology infrastructure, connectivity, collaboration on digital advertising, bringing its own, some of the startups that it's been working with into the mix as well. So just, I suppose there's going to be a reworking, I guess, of how the IOC works with its partners, both on the sponsorship and the media side. And then I guess also just in terms of the business and the way it uses that money, I think there's going to be a bit more of a spotlight on that. I joked at the start about the fact that they held this election in a luxury Greek beach resort. When you hear that the election was going to be in Greece, you immediately assumed it was going to be in Athens, but it was about 4 hours outside of Athens. Lots of money spent on making sure those IOC members were very well pampered throughout the week. And, we talk about the IOC, it's a non-profit organisation. The whole point is that they're meant to spend this money, redistribute it back through the movement. So I think there's going to be a little bit more scrutiny on how that money is distributed. Now that Coventry is in the role, what projects that were implemented under Bach are still kind of worth pursuing, whether she, reprioritizes from that perspective as well, will be interesting to see. So yeah, there's, as you say, impressive top line growth. She's inheriting an organization that has lots of money, but I think how it uses it is kind of an interesting point for discussion.
I imagine during her tenure, we will see a Saudi Arabian company join the top program, given the sort of the existing ties the IOC already has. There's the Olympic Esports Games, which Saudi Arabia is holding, and the kingdom's been very clear that it wants to host the games. Those ties seem to be getting closer and closer. So that seems like something that's inevitable. I wonder what other new markets they might try to look to secure sponsorship from. Maybe India's probably another one. I mean, she wants to keep the games relevant, more relevant globally. She has said that, that'll open up more sponsorship opportunities as well. Those sort of things that feel inevitable.
There was one of the questions I had in my mind is, where the commercial growth comes from, where the opportunities are for the IOC now. They've got their major events mapped out for the foreseeable future, coming back to core kind of traditional Olympic markets in Europe, in the US, Australia. Where are the new opportunities as you see it, guys, in terms of, whether it's new categories, new geographical markets to focus on? How do you see it evolving? And what else, if anything, as Coventry said, around, I guess, the models through which the IOC generates revenue?
Well, this is the thing. She's been quite light on that stuff so far. I know that you attended a round table, Ed, where she spoke about this, but I think she didn't go much further than talking about needing kind of like a review of the programme and how that was going to happen, which is kind of what I was talking about when I said that some of the other candidates definitely put forward more kind of concrete ways that they would bring more money into the ecosystem. So you had I think Samaranch was probably the most explicit in terms of painted the biggest picture in how he was going to bring more money in terms of setting up an investment fund, donor program, outsourcing, basically offering OBS, the services of OBS to other events as well and monetizing it in that way. So again, going back to what I said about Coventry, mentioning during her press conference that she was going to speak to the other candidates about some of the ideas they had, maybe some of those she might be looking at. But I would say that commercial growth at the moment is going to come from going into those different territories. I think that's kind of how you drum up commercial interest. That's how you drive up. This isn't a novel way of thinking, but it's the way that sport has managed to drive new revenues throughout time, is by going into new territories. So yeah, you'd kind of, obviously the media rights in those markets would probably become more valuable if they were to take the games to some of those territories. You'd kind of ignite commercial interest from sponsors as well, as Ed said, obviously Saudi Arabia, but there's lots of other countries in the Middle East who I imagine would be interested in and have the capacity to enter that top program. So I think that's going to be the focus. And I think it felt like that was one of the things that a lot of the candidates were vouching for as well, is, whether it's Africa or somewhere else, is kind of being more accommodating so that more countries in those regions are kind of emboldened to bid to host the games, because obviously at the moment in its traditional window, it's actually too hot in a lot of those places probably to stage it. So there was a lot of talk in the build up about, reworking the sporting calendar a little bit to accommodate some of those other potential hosts. So I think that's probably where the growth is going to come from personally, which again isn't like a completely innovative or creative way of thinking, but it's one that the IOC hasn't necessarily gone down before. So there's still that room for it to grow in that area.
The overarching sense I got when I was on that media roundtable was she wants to kind of broaden the IOC's horizons, which is easier said than done for arguably the most global sports organization in the world. But that kind of comes down to things like financial distribution from top as well, which you touched on, Sam. Like, she wants it to reach more people, and also with prize money as well. Like, she said she's not necessarily in favor of that for the games, but she wants to rather focus on like the top athletes. She wants to benefit like the entire pool that compete. I mean, how many is it at the Olympics? About 10,000, something like that. About 3,000 for the Winter Games. So she wants to sort of create this sort of wider athlete ecosystem, I think, that where it's not where there isn't a sense of haves and haves nots. That was the impression I got anyway. She wants to be able to support them in their career after sport. She wants to be able to reach more athletes outside of games time as well, put systems in place for that. So she essentially said she wants to sit down with the membership and identify new ways of supporting athletes and IFs as well.
And ultimately, that's the nature of the role, right? You got to look out for the have-nots as well as the haves, and the strength of the entire kind of sporting pyramid and how that revenue is redistributed to benefit all nations that have different standards of infrastructure and different needs, requirements, challenges, etc. Solidarity is a big word that's used within the Olympic movement, and obviously that's a big focus for the president. But what about we've spoken there obviously about some of the commercial issues and priorities for Coventry or someone in her role. What about the more political, matters of sporting governance that are on her desk now when we think about, not just athlete compensation and prize money and things, albeit, there are other ways of compensating athletes or allowing them to generate revenue through their participation in the games. But in terms of their rights, and when it comes to things like gender equality and eligibility, things like that, what she said, on sporting matters.
She said that protecting the female category in female sport is paramount. Any decision she makes, she says, will be based on medical and scientific research. Yeah, she favours a blanket ban. She says it's very clear that transgender women are more able, those are her direct words, in the female category, and takeaway opportunities should be equal for women. So she says she plans to set up a task force to address how best to protect women's sport. It's a hot topic, isn't it? We saw that during Paris 2024, but even before that and since. I think the IOC as well, there's some lessons to be learned, really, because this is a very delicate topic. There needs to be sensitivity. Of course there does. But it is I think, for her, it's a very black and white issue. And I think whatever the policy is, it will be guided by that.
So does that mean that we're going to see, I guess, because obviously up to now, the IOC has just kind of, deferred to the IFs and followed whatever kind of policy that they have in place. So she kind of said then that the IOC is going to lead more on this and kind of implement its own policy.
She has said she is in favour of a blanket ban that was taken that they've done in athletics in terms of how. So I would assume, that's laid down by the IOC. But again, having read her manifesto, I'm still not sure yet.
That was kind of the interesting thing I thought about her press conference after being elected. It was it felt that she hadn't said too much in the run up, and then I found that she was actually quite forthcoming in that press conference with her stance on certain things. So not just in terms of the gender side of things, but also in terms of how she's going to deal with Donald Trump, what she said about Russia since as well. And I think that the IOC's press officer joked at the end about that's 20 questions with 20 answers, which I think is a record, is what he said at the end of it in recent times, which is like, it's a joke, but the IOC has definitely it feels like it's become a little bit more secretive, not very transparent in recent times. Its press conferences, you don't necessarily get answers to the questions that are being asked. Fair bit of deflection tactics going on a lot of the time, where it did feel like in that press conference, she was pretty forthcoming with her answers. She was fairly honest. There were some cases where she said, I'm not yet in a position to say exactly how I'm going to tackle that challenge. I mean, after all, she's not president until June, so she can kind of keep saying that for another couple of months at least. But it did feel quite refreshing in that sense, at least anyway, as a journalist watching that press conference.
One thing her manifesto did make a big deal of actually was the need for greater transparency and accountability, and how that would help inform sort of better governance of the IOC as well. So we're obviously already seeing that. I guess if she's anything like Thomas Bach, then she will be very keen to sort of foster strong relationships between the IOC and world leaders. She was very diplomatic when she was asked in that media roundtable how she'd would want to work with Donald Trump. But again, she was just a candidate then. But I imagine the doors will be open for those discussions, and I imagine she'll be wanting to speak to him pretty soon after she takes office.
Sure thing. Well, yeah, as you say, she's not president for another few months yet. She's going to be shadowing back, relocating to Lausanne, and will be, covering, what is to come over the coming years for sure. But just to wrap this up, guys, what's your overarching view of the role of the IOC president and the future of the Olympic movement, and where it sits within the kind of, sporting firmament, I guess, in terms of its relevance currently, alongside some of those other premium, sports properties and brands that are out there? Does it resonate with the audience that is so coveted that they're going after? They've added new sports to the program to be, quote unquote, down with the kids more so, and, things like that. There have been moves to modernize, but do we feel like there's more innovation to come? The IOC can feasibly lead the way, or does it feel like more of a reactionary organization because of the nature of it, and is not necessarily going to be a first mover, and nor does it need to be? But what's your view on it now, based on everything we've just said there and where it sits today?
Do you want to have a stab at that, Sam?
I think in terms of where it sits, there's like two ways to look at like the IOC, because the IOC is kind of obviously this like really just feels like a very archaic sort of sports organization that exists outside. And the Olympics are these only two things that come to life like so infrequently. So outside of that, at least in the way that we cover the Olympic world, you have this kind of, you look at the IOC almost as if this sort of, maybe political isn't the right word, but just like, because obviously they wouldn't want to be thought of that way, but it is just kind of this organization that does actually have a very influential role to play, particularly in global politics, whether they like it or not. And part of me wonders whether Coventry's sort of experience within government is part of the reason that what made her attractive to the IOC membership as well, in that she said herself that she's had experience of dealing with difficult men since she was 20 when she was asked a question about Donald Trump. So let's wonder if that's something that made her attractive, and obviously something that she actually has over back in terms of her experience. So in that sense, the IOC and its place just kind of in the world, let alone sport, it does have a very significant role to play. In terms of like its relevance, I think if you look at Paris last year, like it would be hard to argue that it's not. Like there's very few sporting events that everyone stops to watch for 2 weeks at a time. Maybe they're not tuning into every single event. Obviously, there's peaks and troughs throughout that, but I think when your event is taking place every 2 years, every 4 years, if it's summer to summer Olympics, it's quite hard to necessarily be the one kind of leading the way. There's always going to be an element of being reactionary in that sense. But I think if you look at some of the things they did around Paris last year in terms of how they worked with their broadcasters in particular, went after audiences on social, I think some of the sports that they have introduced have been a success. Not all of them, obviously. Breaking kind of went viral for the wrong reasons and won't continue in the program. But I think the way they are balancing that is kind of generating more intrigue around it. It probably is bringing in new audiences. And so, yeah, I think you'd struggle to argue that it's not relevant. If you look at the audience figures around it, I think it's in a pretty good place personally.
The IOC president needs to be everything from like a diplomat to a deal maker. And I think, every IOC president has to make sure the games are fit for purpose. That's just the remit. For Bach, that meant transforming the bidding process, expanded the role of the Olympic movement, stuff like that.
Olympic Channel,
indeed. Yeah, I mean, he was very successful in growing the marketing and media platform, as you mentioned. Maybe too successful because it's a very high bar that Kirsty Coventry is going to have to maintain. I think with the Olympic Games, it's not an open goal, but you've got all the ingredients there. It's almost a case of you just don't want to kind of mess it up. But given everything that's going on in the world at the moment, we've mentioned Russia, we've mentioned other things on our plate. Like, I think really she needs to kind of make sure that the Olympic Games is still able to do what it does best, which, as you mentioned, Sam, is, lots of people tune in. It is a moment in time. She's got to sort of navigate the shoals of political diplomacy in various avenues. So yeah, I don't envy her, but she's got the pedigree. She's clearly got the support of her predecessor. So it's that hot take, isn't it? We will see.
What do you think, Mike? I ask because I feel like when I came into SportsPro, it was kind of, I don't know, it felt like focus on the Olympics was shift and kind of maybe the sense around it in terms of what people thought of the Olympics has started to shift a little bit. And as you say, like other organisations in sport were starting to get more of a reputation as being like the innovative, forward-thinking sports properties and that kind of stuff, as opposed to maybe, whereas before people had always looked to the Olympics for that leadership, maybe. Yeah, I don't know what you think about that. I guess that question that you posed to Ed and I.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think it has, genuinely transformed under Bach. I think obviously they went through a run of games in new markets and, there were pretty significant levels of scandal and controversy around the Olympic movement, back when Bach came into power. It just felt like the IOC was this kind of slow-moving tanker that was reacting to other things that were happening in the industry. It, operated in a bubble, bit tone deaf to what was happening outside of that Olympic movement, perhaps. Felt like this kind of onerous thing, like the Olympic Games have become this so big that no city could feasibly kind of live up to it and deliver it as, necessarily, albeit you had London. It just felt like the relevance had been dwindling for a few years, and Bach kind of, I think through the changes in the Olympic program, through the launch of the Olympic Channel, that the media and marketing initiatives that he oversaw, has managed to get it back on a far stronger footing. Coming off the back of Paris, I think, as you say, there can be no denying that it's just this phenomenal event that is a unifying force in a way that kind of no other sporting event is. Obviously, you've got the FIFA World Cup, but that's in a single sport. It just brings everyone together. And I think, it's a real showcase, I think, for the industry as one of the biggest, events on the planet. And I think, as I said at the top of this podcast, I think it has rediscovered its mojo off the back of that. There is no escaping that the Olympic world is replete with members of royalty, it's intertwined, entangled with governments and heads of state and the bosses of major global corporations. There's always going to be varying interests and conflicting interests and things to be mindful of. But I think in the minds of fans, the Olympics is the pinnacle of sport. And there's so much that happens between games. As we've been saying, almost it forces, there's that trickle down effect of, if the Olympic Games is strong and the federations and those who run them are kind of bought into the Olympic Games kind of vision and that movement, then that trickles down into world championships. It trickles down into the creation of new leagues and, new concepts further down the pyramid. And I think there's just so much content to come out of the Olympic world. I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen Courts of Gold, the basketball documentary on Netflix, kind of produced by the Olympic Channel. Incredible content that can come out of the here and now, the latest games, but with so much backstory, so much history and tradition entwined within that it's ripe for storytelling. And I think if they can really lean into that as much as anything else, distribute across, other channels and platforms like Netflix, etc., then they're only going to resonate more with the younger audiences. So I think, there's a huge opportunity there for them to capitalize upon, and there will be some missteps along the way, whether it's new sports on the program or doping scandals, for example, that they don't necessarily have outright control over. But I think they are willing now to try new things. So I think everyone would be wishing Kirsty Coventry well and kind of hoping that she can kind of deliver and do some, preside over some interesting things and not just be a kind of puppet's probably the wrong word, but just be the face of this kind of global organization and not really try to implement her vision and make her mark. So time will tell, I think. And as I said, we'll cover it closely as we go. But thank you guys. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you for your thoughts. Always a pleasure to talk and dig into your knowledge and insights around this particular subject. Plenty more content over on sportspro.com for those watching and listening around not only the IOC election, but just about everything else that is going on in the world of sport. So do check that out. But thank you, Sam. Thank you, Ed.
Cheers, chaps.
Cheers, gents.